I want to start off by saying a little bit about climate change as a big topic. It can get overwhelming to think about what's happening with climate change on a global scale. It can get overwhelming when we think about the impact of climate change even here, closer to home. What this talk is focusing on is the impact of climate change specific to our gardens. So we're drilling down and focusing on the issues that are most relevant to home gardeners rather than the whole landscape of climate change. And so during the first part of the talk, which focuses on the impact of climate change, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we're expecting with regard to rising temperatures, what is predicted in terms of precipitation and ecosystem change and soil alterations in terms of the main impacts of climate change that are relevant to Marin home gardeners. The other thing I kind of want to lead with is this topic can feel difficult because climate change is such a fundamental threat to the earth and to our society. And I don't want to, given that we're in the middle of COVID, given that we're in the middle of fires all around us and an orange sky, I don't want to kind of pile on and make us feel like things are more apocalyptic than they really need to be today. And so fortunately, the second part of this talk is focusing on mitigation that we can do through our gardening practices that can help climate change be a little bit less severe. And so we're going to end on solutions. We're going to start with the threats and end on solutions. So that's kind of the outline of where we're going today. I just also want to start with some definitions. You're all familiar with how weather and climate differ from each other. So weather, as we know, is the day-to-day patterns, the day-to-day experience and observation of temperature, of precipitation, of the other atmospheric conditions around us. Climate is long-term trends in the weather. And so when we talk about, for example, Northern California having a Mediterranean climate, that's our basic climate. When we talk about climate change, we're actually looking at trends in our climate over time. And these are long-term changes in our weather patterns that have begun since the mid-1850s, since the industrial age, due largely to human activities, in specifically the release of or the use of fossil fuels, burning of fossil fuels, which release greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and like methane and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. And that's what the cause of climate change is. It's been much more apparent, even though it's been really going on when we step back and look at long-term trends, it's been much more apparent in the last 35 years or so. So that's just to get kind of definitions out of the way. I want to start with temperatures and thinking about what we've already experienced here in the Bay Area. Between 1950 and 2005, our average annual high temperatures increased about 1.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The best predictions are that we're likely to see an additional 3% increase in our maximum temperatures by the middle of this century. So already on top of the 1.7 that we've experienced. Now, of course, that 3 degrees could be less if our society takes very, very strong measures to decrease our fossil fuel emissions and results in drawing down carbon in the atmosphere. It could be more if our society doesn't take strong measures to do that. So that's the temperature trend that we're expecting to see here. And wherever possible, I'm going to give you statistics, data that come from our region, so that we're really thinking about what is happening right here in the Bay Area. One of the observations that is very relevant to gardeners about rising temperature trends is that the USDA plant hardiness zones are moving. Many of you are familiar with these charts that kind of look like the figure on this slide, that show different colors for different climate zones in the US. And the USDA hardiness zones reflect low temperatures. They reflect where frost dates are changing. When they redid their plant hardiness zone map in 2012, almost half of the US, of the places in the US, had a change of zone. So that's just some evidence about how temperatures have already changed in the US. And the people who've done some research on this recently have predicted that these plant hardiness zones are going to continue to move north at about 13 miles for every decade. Where we are, actually, they're going to probably move inland rather than north, since our climate zones really go from the coast to the Central Valley and then up into the mountains. But if we think about kind of our next warmer climate zone here in Marin County, it's a little bit inland of us in Sonoma, or a little bit north of us in Sonoma. So right here, the climate zones are kind of moving, the warm zones are moving towards the coast. So what are the impacts? What are some of the primary impacts of these rising temperatures on our gardens? We know that most plants need a dormant period in their off season, so that they can store up energy for their growth spurt. Usually winter is dormant, usually spring is the primary growth season, but that's not true for all plants. But if we don't have adequate cool weather in the winter, plants may not get the rest that they need for stronger growth the next season. We also know, those of us who have orchards, or even just a couple of fruit trees, that most varieties of fruit and nuts need a certain amount of cold, chilling temperatures in the winter in order to produce a crop. That's called chill periods. And if our climate is warming, we may find our fruit and nut trees not getting the adequate chill that they need. Another really interesting observation for the Northern California coast is that our fog has decreased quite a lot. In fact, some recent research showed that the hours of fog per day decreased by about 3 hours between the beginning of the last century and now. So in about the last 100 years, there's about 3 hours less fog a day here on the Northern California coast, which many of our plants depend on. So that's making it warmer. Another impact of rising temperatures is that we can find ourselves really enjoying some nice warm days throughout the winter. We may have some periods during December, January, February of really nice warm days, and the plants feel that too. And they think it's spring and they start to grow, and then we get some more frost and their early growth, whether that's leaves or buds, gets frozen. And so that's another impact of rising temperatures. So let's go on to the next impact, and that is rainfall. The climate models are uncertain in terms of precipitation for this area in terms of kind of the next 20, 30, 40 years or so. And the best models say that our average precipitation isn't expected to change very much. On the other hand, we may see more variability year to year, with some years where there's a lot of precipitation and then other years where there's droughts, or year after year of drought. And one of the hallmarks actually of climate change is uncertainty. The physical systems that are driving climate change, what's happening in the atmosphere, what's happening in the ocean with ocean temperatures, with ocean salinity, with melting of polar ice caps, with the winds, all of the systems that are driving climate change in the face of fossil fuel emissions into the atmosphere are really complex and have feedback loops that can get out of whack. Feedback loops that can kind of send the system into very unstable patterns. And that's part of what is expected to drive greater uncertainty in our climate in the face of climate change. So that helps to explain why we're going to see more variability. We know that our largest winter storms are going to become more damaging and more intense. And so let's talk about extreme rainfall. We call these, you've all heard about atmospheric rivers. These are the storm systems that come out of the tropics. And so they're warm storm systems, and the atmosphere within these storm systems carries an enormous amount of moisture, and they call them atmospheric rivers because the amount of moisture carried in these storms is comparable to the amount of water measured at the mouths of some very large rivers. So what the predictions are is that we're going to be seeing more frequent, during wet years, more frequent atmospheric rivers where the rain is falling kind of all at once. In a 2 or 3 day period, we just get deluged with several inches of rain. And you all are familiar with impacts of that from a couple of winters ago. In fact, the winters of both 2017 and 2019 brought a lot of damage to Marin County from flooding. We saw a house fall down a hill in Sausalito. We saw Highway 37 flooded and closed. We saw mudslides and trees falling and structures being damaged from flooding. When you have heavy rain and you are in a coastal situation, as we are on both our bay shore and our ocean shore, we have the impact of sea level rise combined with heavy rainfalls. And that can increase the risk, increase the amount of water that we're dealing with in extreme rainfall events. Add king tides to that, and you really have a situation that is damaging. So that's some of the impacts of sorry, just catching up with my notes here. Some of the impacts of extreme rainfall. In terms of the other extreme, and that is too little rainfall, and that's drought. Our Mediterranean climate is naturally, we expect several months during the year, 8 months during the year of very, very little rain, and 4 months of the year with rainfall concentrated in the winter months. So that's our typical climate. But what we're seeing in the face of climate change is that we're getting more years where we don't have our adequate winter rains. So the winter comes and goes, and we've got 12 or 15 or 18 inches of rain rather than 30 or 35 inches of rain that we're expecting. We had a 5-year drought in 2012 to 2016. That was the most severe in terms of soil moisture in the last 1,200 years. And in terms of snowpack in the Sierra, it was a 1 in 500 year low snow event. So even though we're not expecting to see changes in average precipitation, we will be seeing less predictability in terms of whether we're going to get our winter rains or not. With some years a lot, some years less. The other thing about that, even if the average rainfall year to year remains about what it has been, we're going to be living in higher temperatures. And so higher temperatures plus the same amount of moisture still means that the soil dries out more quickly, plants dry out more quickly, and we end up with drought impacts in gardens, but we also end up with the impact of fire. And so we're living through this right now. We had a low rainfall winter, and the fuel is very, very dry right now, and California is burning. So this is a very, very evident and severe impact of climate change that is evident right before our eyes, unfortunately. So a few weeks ago, so I live in Point Reyes Station, and the Woodward fire is burning less than 3 miles from my house. And I've been listening to the morning updates that the firefighters are giving. And a couple of weeks ago, the fire chief made a comment that I thought was really interesting. He said the fire that day, the day before, had spread up this this canyon that had very large Douglas firs, and the firs were hung with moss. And he said normally this moss would be dripping wet from the fog. He said, but this moss this year is bone dry. And so those Doug firs are going up like candles when the moss catches on fire. And I thought that was a kind of sad but interesting observation relating to the fact that we're seeing less fog than we have because of climate change. We're seeing less fog. The next impact I want to talk about just a little bit is ecosystem changes from the impacts of changing climate. And this is relevant to our plants. This is relevant to insects. This is relevant to animal communities. And so as the types of plants we grow become out of sync with the climate, with the changing climate, they may be getting more diseases because they're not healthy. They may be blooming earlier, and so they're out of sync with their pollinators. They may be vulnerable to being taken over by invasive plants, which have advantages that let them compete better than some of our native plants. And so you can get vegetation communities changing, and you can get the interactions between those vegetation communities and the beneficial insects that live with them. And that can have impact on, say, not only home gardener food pollination and flower pollination, but pollination in our food production agricultural system as well. Another possibility is that Marin might become less suitable for our iconic evergreen species like redwoods and Douglas fir, and different kinds of vegetation may survive better and thrive and move in. And then finally, we're also concerned with animal ecosystems and how they interact with our plant systems. Many of us are bird watchers, or in other ways we enjoy watching how wildlife interacts with our home garden areas. And finally, I want to talk about soil. And in fact, some of the ecosystem changes are actually mediated by what's happening in the soil. We don't always think about soil as being impacted by climate, but underneath our feet, soil is a very complex and living system that supports plant life and stores water and stores carbon. And climate change impacts the structure of the soil. It impacts the availability of nutrients in the soil, and it impacts the microbial communities that are living in the soil. The soil is filled with a whole living ecosystem consisting of mycorrhizal fungi and all kinds of other living organisms. And all of this can be altered in the face of climate change. So soil is really complex, and the ways that it responds to climate change are both direct and indirect. And another interesting thing about kind of figuring out what's going to happen to soil in the face of climate change is that increased precipitation has different impacts than decreased precipitation. And we just talked about how we may see both increased flooding in some years and increased drought in other years. And so those have their own distinct impacts on climate change. We're expecting that water scarcity is also going to alter, not also, but water scarcity alters soil structure, soil erosion, and impacts the ability of the soils to support plant life. Soils contain about twice as much carbon as the atmosphere. So if you think about the soil, we all know that there's carbon in the atmosphere. That's what's causing climate change when those carbon levels increase. But the soil is an enormous sink for carbon, and in fact is a bigger sink for carbon than the atmosphere. This is good news because we have the capacity, and I'll talk about that in the second part of the talk, to increase the ability of the soil to store carbon. So the fact that the soil is such a large carbon sink is good. But increased temperatures can accelerate the loss of carbon from soil. there's been some interesting research lately showing that in the tropics, this is particularly a threat because tropical soils store a lot of carbon, and we know that global warming is happening fairly dramatically in the tropics. And so that's a threat we need to try to, not in the context of Marin home gardeners, but in the context of kind of what we advocate for in terms of climate change mitigation policies. That's something important to keep in mind. So in summary, we've talked about the main predicted impacts of climate change that are relevant to Marin home gardeners being expected temperature increases of about, maximum temperature increases of about 3 degrees over the next 25 to 30 years, increased variability in our precipitation, the way that plant communities, animal communities, and insect communities may change the way they interact together, and the way that climate change may impact soil. And so we're going to stop right here with the gloom and doom. We're going to move to some mitigation. Before I do that, are there any questions, Barbara, that you want to bring up that people have asked?
We don't have a question, but we do have a comment.
Okay.
By Amy, who notes that it's important to know how the transportation sector contributes large amount of emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that's a perfect segue into mitigation. I did get just a question though about how resilient are microorganisms?
That's a good question. And
it's a good question.
That's a really good question. I know that fungi and other microorganisms living in the soil can take some amount of temperature fluctuation, but I am not personally familiar with the research on what it would take to send them over, to send them over the edge. What kind of sustained temperature increase or decrease? But that's a good question. Anything else? Okay. So we're obviously going to need to adapt our gardens to the climate we know is already here, and in particular is coming, is still changing. And those adaptation strategies are the subject of part 2 of this presentation, which is going to be on September 30th at the same time, 4 o'clock. And that's up on the Civic Center Library website. And also the Master Gardener website has a link to that. But what I want to focus on for the next half hour or so, 20 minutes or so, is climate change mitigation through gardening. The good news is that we as gardeners, in our teeny tiny ways, can take steps that decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And that's the definition of mitigation in the context of climate change. In normal life, mitigation just simply means reducing the seriousness of something. But in the context of climate change, mitigation means specifically decreasing the amount of CO2 that we emit to the atmosphere. So what are we going to cover here? We're going to cover 5 best practices that allow us to change carbon emissions as gardeners. The first one I'm going to talk about is carbon farming. And by that, I'm going to be thinking about both what we do in the soil and what we do with the plants we grow. We're going to talk about water conservation as a climate change mitigation strategy. We're going to talk about home edibles. We're going to talk about some plant care practices that are carbon conscious, and we're going to talk about managing plant and food waste. And some of you are probably already doing some of these things, and that's great. And hopefully you'll learn about some new things that you can also give a whirl. So let's start with carbon farming. You may know that increasing the amount of organic carbon in the soil enhances the structure of the soil. Soil, as I mentioned a bit earlier, is a big sink, is a big storage compartment for carbon. So if we can increase soil's productivity, the soil stores more carbon. If we can grow more vegetation on our land, trees and plants store carbon. So these are the two primary carbon farming strategies. Before I get into that though, I want to just review the carbon cycle for those of you who it's been 45 years since you learned this in high school. So this is the carbon cycle simplified. Plants work their magic through photosynthesis. They take carbon from the air and they convert it to plant tissue. So that's pretty magic. Plant residues decompose, and this returns carbon to the soil. Another thing that returns carbon to the soil in a natural ecosystem is animal feces. And the microorganisms decompose those and return the carbon to the soil. The soil then in turn emits or respires carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And that in turn starts the cycle over again. So this is the carbon cycle that we're referring to when we talk about carbon farming. So what do we mean by carbon farming? We want to try to increase the productivity of the soil. Think about soil being the key to locking up carbon. Soil holds carbon, it also stores water, and the fact that both of those things happen helps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The more productive the soil is, that is, the more biomass that's grown on the soil, the more plants, grasses, shrubs, trees that are grown in the soil, the more carbon the soil can hold. And the roots of the plants have a good bit to do with that. It's kind of circular. When you increase the productivity of the soil, you increase its ability to hold water. When you increase the soil's ability to hold water, you increase its ability to grow plants. And when you increase its ability to grow plants, you're increasing the amount of carbon it stores. So these three things, water holding capacity, productivity of the soil, and water storage of the soil, all work together in this bidirectional or tridirectional way as a system. There are some practices that we can use to increase the ability of the soil to store carbon. We can reduce disturbing the soil. We can reduce tilling the soil. And this is particularly important for food gardeners who aren't planting, usually you're not planting, well, when you're planting ornamentals, you don't dig up the soil every season. But when you're growing food garden, you often, you're rotating stuff in and out all year round. In our climate, we're lucky to have a 12-month gardening climate. And the best practice these days, and Barbara and I've seen much more attention to this in the last several years, is to reduce the amount that we disturb the soil when we take out old plants and plant new plants. So reducing tillage leaves that carbon undisturbed. And a lot of that is through the mechanism of not disturbing that network, just that, if you could see the amount of fungi, of mycorrhizal fungi that are living in the soil, if you disturb the soil less, those fungi stay more intact and store more carbon. Another best practice is to cover the soil either with plants or crops or with porous material, with mulch, with something that lets the water through but protects the surface of the soil so that the soil doesn't erode and doesn't lose carbon to the atmosphere. The one caveat to that I always think about when we're thinking about kind of systems biodiversity is we want to leave a little bit of bare soil for our ground nesting native bees. They need bare soil to nest. So you don't want to cover every square inch of your soil with mulch, but you do want to leave a little bit of bare soil for the bees, but mostly try to keep the soil covered. And then master gardeners have we have a few mantras, but one of our mantras is compost, compost, compost. The other one is mulch, mulch, mulch. Adding compost to the soil provides the soil with a steady source of kind of low-level nutrient that improves the soil structure, improves the ability of the soil to store water, and improves the productivity of the soil, its ability to grow plants. So compost is a really important part of this. Another way to farm carbon is to plant stuff. Any kind of plant stores carbon. The bigger the plant and the longer the plant lives, the more carbon it stores. So we can get our biggest bang for the buck by planting larger plants, trees and shrubs that live a long time. Because remember, if they die, they then decompose. They either decompose when you put them in your green bin and they go to the compost facility, or they decompose, on your land. And so by choosing long-lived plants, we are choosing a long-term carbon storage solution. Trees also provide shade and windbreaks. One of the things we need to pay attention to when choosing trees, remember how I talked just a few minutes ago about how the climate zones are moving? In the middle of the country, they're moving north, but here on the coast of California, they're moving towards, the inland climates are moving towards the coasts. And so in choosing a tree, you need to think about what grows well in the kind of southern end, in our case, in the more inland end of our climate zone, because that's the climate we're going to have in 15 years. And if you're choosing a long-lived tree, you need to choose a tree that's going to live well for 20, 40, 50 years or more. And so we want to not necessarily take our clues from what's been growing well here for the last 100 years. We want to take our clues from what grows well in climate zones that are near to us in the direction that our climate is changing. We want to plant trees in locations that save energy, that is, in locations that may shade the house from the hot afternoon sun, but we need to be aware of fire smart landscaping principles when we're doing that. We don't want to plant trees right on top of the house. You want to keep tree branches at least 10 feet from the house. So we want to make sure to follow fire smart landscaping principles. And then in terms of caring for trees, hand tools or electric tools are more climate conscious than tools that run on gasoline or other fossil fuels. So hand pruners, or at the, you know, if you need to use something powered, electricity, because a lot of our electricity comes from renewable sources. So electricity is better than fossil fuels. Just a few interesting things about urban trees. The impact and potential of urban trees has been getting some attention in the popular press and in the research literature lately. And I just wanted to give you a couple statistics. A recent multi-city study estimated that as a whole, the urban trees across the US accumulate nearly 1 million tons of carbon in their tissues per year. And that's more than the annual emissions of LA County from industry, from cars, and from homes. So urban trees have the capacity to store carbon and draw down the carbon in the atmosphere. And here's another little statistic. This was a Californian study, estimated that urban trees offset Sacramento County's carbon dioxide emissions by nearly 2%. And 2% doesn't sound like a lot, but every little bit is part of the solution. We need to use lots of different climate greenhouse gas reducing strategies to get a handle on controlling climate change. And so gardeners can be a little part of that. Okay, the next strategy is to conserve water. And I know you've all thought about water as a scarce resource. And it's particularly evident during our droughts when reservoirs get low and rivers get low. Water is just a scarce resource here in our climate. And so we're all pretty conscious about doing our part to conserve water. But some of you may not have thought about the fact that water conservation is also a climate change mitigation strategy. So why is that? It's because in order to create fresh water, drinking water, it takes a lot of energy, not only to treat the water and make it potable, but the distribution system for water and the extraction of the water, if it comes from, it has to be extracted from under the soil, also take energy. And so one estimate that Barbara and I have seen is that water accounts for 13% of the US electricity pie. So if we think about all the things in the US that are powered by electricity, water takes 13% of that pie, which is really a very significant fraction of our energy use in the US. So that's why water conservation in the garden and in the rest of your life is a climate change mitigation strategy, because we're saving on the energy that it would have taken to produce the water and distribute the water that we conserve. That said, we don't want to kind of just give up on watering our gardens and try not to water our gardens. We've got to, all plants need some kind of water, at least to get started. We need to hydrate them wisely, and we also need to be fire smart. We need to plant landscapes that are going to reduce, that are not going to increase the spread of fire if it comes to our home. So in order to be wise with plant hydration, drip irrigation is the very best strategy for delivering water really efficiently right to the root zone where plants need it. It doesn't, unlike kind of overhead sprinkling, which gets the whole land wet, even where plants, even on the mulch, you really don't need to water your mulch. But drip irrigation is really efficient. And take care of your drip irrigation system so you don't have leaks. So you know what your controller is doing, so you don't have, you know, runoff. Drip irrigation system is a water conservation strategy. Mulching is another water conservation strategy because it helps the soil retain water for a longer time between. You'll notice your soil doesn't dry out. You don't need to water as often if you mulch. Ideally with an organic mulch that will decompose into the soil, but some people use, especially if to be more fire smart, some people use other kinds of gravel or rocks, some kind of more hardscape kind of mulch, especially right next to their house. But any kind of mulch helps the soil retain water. Choose the right plant for the right place. That's another Master Gardener mantra. And so we know we need to choose plants that are adapted to our Mediterranean climate, which is summer dry, winter wet. That's our climate. And so we want to choose the kinds of plants that are adapted to those conditions. Especially native plants are especially adapted, but any kind of plant from a Mediterranean climate that takes a summer dry, winter wet landscape helps to reduce water usage, and we're not trying to apply a ton of water to keep, say, hydrangeas watered appropriately all summer long during the dry season. Another thing you can do is put in some rainwater barrels and harvest your rainwater, and then use it through the early spring after rainy season and into the early summer after rainy season starts. If your land supports it, you could create bioswales and kind of capture the places where your water naturally tends to run off. If you live on a hillside, for example, you can create bioswales, or places where it's damper, places where your soil is wetter. You can create rain gardens. So there's various strategies, and certainly having porous pathways and driveways also helps the water infiltrate back into the land. Okay. Oh, one other thing about hydrating plants wisely. If we apply water more slowly, it tends to soak into the soil, and that's another thing that drip irrigation does really well. Okay, this is my personal favorite. I'm a home food gardener and grow a lot of fruits and vegetables here on my land. In fact, a couple of weeks ago, I harvested a red cabbage that weighed over 14 pounds, and I was super proud of this big red cabbage. In fact, it was so big that when I held it in my arms, the big outer leaves, you know, practically covered my face. But I was just thrilled to death with this gigantic cabbage that I grew. And so, why is growing your own food a climate mitigation strategy? So let's think through a few different aspects to that. First of all, growing your own food when people grow their own food, they are more enthusiastic about eating a lot of fruits and vegetables. That's just kind of, it always happens. You grow your own food, you get excited about eating what you grow. Kids get excited about eating what they help grow. I go back to Michael Pollan's quote, "Eat food, not too much, mostly plants." Plants, calorie by calorie, have a much smaller carbon footprint than eating meat or animal products. Various animal products have various carbon footprints, but on the whole, eating fruits and vegetables has a much smaller carbon footprint. So by growing our own food and eating more vegetables and fruit, we are contributing to a smaller carbon footprint. Another argument not argument, but another aspect of growing your own food that makes it a climate mitigation strategy is if you use organic practices. So rather than applying synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides, we're using different kinds of usually more intensive hand practices. And organic food requires about 30 to 50% less energy input. This is in agriculture actually, than non-organic, conventional foods. And because there's less powered equipment used and there's less synthetic fertilizers used, that synthetic fertilizers really usually provide too much nitrogen, more than the soil can absorb for the use of plant nutrition. And so that nitrogen comes off the soil, is emitted off the soil in the form of nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. Buying organic food or growing organic food is typically has a lower carbon footprint than conventional practices. Another thing about growing your own food is it doesn't have to be transported. And somebody talked about the climate footprint, or the commenter earlier mentioned the climate footprint of our transportation system. So imagine you're growing the food yourself, that transportation system is then eliminated and the carbon footprint of transporting and refrigerating food grown elsewhere is eliminated. That's fossil fuel emissions that contribute to greenhouse gases. If you're not growing your own food, another solution is to buy locally grown food. That also eliminates the carbon footprint of the kind of global agricultural transport and storage system. So I know a lot of us are farmers market supporters and like to look for food that is locally grown. I have just a couple of little factoids for you. One study showed that eating all locally grown food for 1 year could save the greenhouse gas equivalent of driving 1,000 miles. So that's kind of cool. It's tiny, right? But again, tiny impacts add up to climate change mitigation. Eating a vegetarian meal 1 day a week could save the equivalent of driving 1,160 miles in 1 day a week for a year could save that equivalent greenhouse gas emissions. So filling your garden with vegetables and fruit and then being excited about eating a more plant-based diet is a climate change mitigation strategy. Okay, carbon conscious plant care means a few different things. As I talked about before, when I talked about taking care of trees, it can mean using hand tools, or electric tools rather than tools that run on gasoline or other fossil fuels. It can mean avoiding chemical pesticides. And if you've heard other Master Gardener presentations, you may be familiar with the term integrated pest management. This is the fundamental practice that we as Master Gardeners promote, where the first strategies that we advocate for in dealing with plant pests and plant diseases, and in fact with plant care, are the ones that have a low impact to the environment. So instead of things like picking off cucumber beetles rather than spraying them with a synthetic pesticide. So anyway, chemical pesticides in the framework of integrated pest management are the last solution we look at. We sometimes, in order to save a valuable plant, need to apply a synthetic pesticide, but we try to avoid doing that when there are other lower impact strategies that can have the same beneficial effect. Another carbon conscious plant care strategy that I mentioned before is to use compost and organic fertilizers rather than chemical fertilizers. Organic fertilizers feed the soil, enhance soil structure, enhance nutrient availability to plants, rather than in a way that's much healthier for plants than chemical fertilizers. Another strategy that you can adopt if you are a edibles gardener is to plant cover crops in between your vegetables that you're growing or fruit that you're growing. And so, for example, if you are getting ready to pull out your, probably if you live in a hot place in Marin, like Novato or the warmer areas of San Rafael, your tomatoes may be just about done. You're getting ready to pull out your tomatoes and you're not planning to put something else in that bed maybe for the winter. Maybe you're done in that particular bed for the year. So maybe you want to plant a cover crop of fava beans or bell beans or red clover, something to keep the soil covered. Remember, we talked about covered soil emits less carbon to the atmosphere than bare soil. But the other thing that a cover crop does, if it's a legume, is to store nitrogen, add nitrogen to the soil. So some cover crops in the legume family are helping the soil be more nutritious for the next crop of plants that you're going to put in there, because they add that essential element, nitrogen, into the soil where it's going to be available for the roots of the next crop you're going to grow. Another plant care strategy, if you're an edibles grower, is to rotate your food crops. That helps keep your crops less prone to be diseased, less needing to use chemical interventions on your plant. And finally, I wanted to just say a couple of words about peat moss. Peat is a kind of soil that's grown in just a few places around the world, not grown, that formed from degradation of plant material in a few specialized places in the world. And when peat moss holds an enormous amount of carbon, much more carbon than kind of typical soils. And so when peat is mined to make peat moss for our gardening, for soil mixes and potting soil and stuff like that, there's a lot of carbon release to the atmosphere when peat is mined. And so Barbara and I have been seeing much more focus lately on cautioning gardeners to be aware of reducing their use of peat moss containing soil mixes. And then finally, this is the last strategy that I'm going to talk about, and that is how we manage our plant and food waste. Food waste accounts for a large proportion of landfill tonnage. Marin County in particular has a problem with this. A recent study by, or statistics collected by Drawdown Marin showed that 30% of what was in the landfill here was food waste and 8% was green waste. So that's 38%. By capturing this waste, either in our home compost piles, if we have them, or in the green bin at the very least, we could reduce the greenhouse emissions that result when the organic waste in a landfill is decomposed anaerobically. When organic waste undergoes decomposition without oxygen, it emits methane. And methane is a super potent greenhouse gas, much more potent than carbon dioxide. And so we want to avoid at all costs organic materials going into our landfills. We want to get them into the green waste system where they're composted under oxygenated conditions and turned into a valuable soil nutrient and soil amendment. So we can compost our plant and food waste ourselves, or we can put it in the green bin. But at any rate, no matter where you get your compost, it's good for your garden. A couple of other practices in terms of the green waste we produce. You can mulch your leaves and leave them in place. You don't actually need to get them off your garden. They can serve as mulch. The same thing if you have a lawn and you mow your lawn, leave the grass clippings on the lawn. They help make your lawn more healthy and return some nutrients to your lawn. So in summary, these are the strategies that I've talked about to help us mitigate climate change, to help us do our own little parts to decrease the amount of carbon dioxide emissions from our gardening practices and to help our soil store carbon. So carbon farming, both in the soil and in large plants, water conservation, home edibles gardening, carbon conscious plant care, and plant and food waste. I'm going to stop it there and invite you to type your questions into chat. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to slowly go through a couple of resource slides so that you can see some of the references we used. And I'll put up resources in a second. Are there questions, Barbara?
We had a question that was actually answered in chat, which is wonderful. But in case not everyone is reading chat, the question was about legume cover crops. And it was whether they need to be inoculated in order to create nitrogen in the roots, or can nitrogen be created without the inoculation? And Raul, who runs the garden at IBC, the Marin Master Gardener's Garden at IBC, answered, saying that yes, they can, but without using an inoculant, you won't create as much nitrogen in the roots as you would otherwise.
Great, thank you, Raul. I think it's a bigger issue in agriculture, where they're really thinking on a very large scale about getting every ounce of productivity out of their field. I know relatively few home gardeners who use the inoculants with their cover crops. But yeah, they do enhance the nitrogen producing capacity. Thanks, Raul. Thanks for that question. Any other questions?
We also had a question about using gray water as another way to reduce water usage.
That's a really good point. I don't have a gray water system, but I looked into this for my house, and what I learned is that gray water, like from your washing machine and your, not your bathroom, but from your kitchen faucets and your laundry room, can be used to irrigate trees and larger plants. It doesn't work through a drip emitter system. You have to have emitters that that have larger holes, that have larger tubing and larger holes. And so if you have the ability to create a gray water system to water some trees and shrubs, that's very doable. And the permitting process through Marin County Environmental Health is very easy and straightforward. They've tried to make it really easy for people with a minimum of bureaucratic paperwork to get permission to install a gray water system.
My understanding is that you wouldn't want to use it for vegetables in your garden though, right?
That, yes, you don't want to you can use it for like fruit trees because it doesn't have any ability to get into the fruit, but you wouldn't want to use it for a vegetable or strawberries or something like that you're going to be eating.
We have a question. What is an inoculant?
An inoculant is a material you can buy at a nursery that you use to coat the seeds of your cover crop. So say you're planting fava beans, you make this powder into like a slurry, and you coat your seeds in it, and that helps the plant, that helps inoculate the soil so that, I guess, I'm not exactly sure how it works, but it helps the soil help the plant be able to produce more nitrogen in the soil. Raul, do you want to, if you know more than that, do you want to jump in, or anybody else?
Raul, you can just press the space bar to unmute yourself. If you're there. Maybe he's gone.
Maybe he's gone.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. I want to thank everybody for coming, for showing up in your little Zoom square. The Marin Master Gardeners are working hard to stay in touch despite what COVID has dealt us. And so we are presenting public seminars at the Civic Center Library this fall, at the Corte Madera Library, and at Sausalito, I think. Anyway, links to all of our all of our seminars are on our Master Gardener website, which is here, marinmg.ucanr.edu. We have a remote help desk that's still running, taking inquiries via email. And there's the address of our help desk. If you have plant problems you need help solving, we are still here. The phone is being staffed, but there's usually not, you won't be able to reach somebody for advice on the spot. And when we open back up, our help desk is on Novato Boulevard, but we're not staffing there in the office right now. We have a free newsletter that comes out with lots of great gardening advice, really interesting articles, beautiful photos, and that's an emailed newsletter. You can sign up for that. We also have a program called Garden Walks, which is a free home visit by a pair of master gardeners that lasts about an hour, and they walk with you around your property. They look, if you have an irrigation system, they look at your irrigation system with you, and they focus on water conservation and other best practices in home gardens in Marin. So you can call or email our office and request getting on the list for a garden walk. So lots of ways to stay in touch, and we hope to see you in one of these venues again. Thank you so much for coming.
Kathy, before you go,
okay.
Could you put the resources slide back up? So if someone wanted to take a photo of it, or the one before that, the links, I guess
references.
Yeah, the references, and then the other one, quickly after that. So if someone would capture that screen or take a photo of it, they could have the links.
Sure. These were the primary references that we used in the talk, and there were a lot of other references too that we can give you access to if you have questions about any particular point that we brought up. But these are some really good general references. And then,
I wanted to say I'm going to be sending an evaluation form out after the meeting, and I'll be sending out the Zoom link for part 2 shortly.
Great, thank you, Linda. These are some good local resources for climate change issues, climate activism issues. And Yard Smart Marin has a bunch of, they focus on reducing pesticide use. So that's a good resource for that.
I also probably should mention that we have a lot of information on Fire Smart landscaping on the website for people. We've mentioned Fire Smart a few times. So if
excellent.
if you go to the Marin Master Gardeners website, you'll find a lot of information about Fire Smart.
Great. Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Take care. Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.